People don't evaluate you after you speak. No, they have already decided who you are before you even open your mouth. And the most uncomfortable part is, they don't judge you based on facts, but on what you trigger in their minds. You may be intelligent. You may be capable. You may know exactly what you are doing. But if you look like someone without value, you will be treated that way. No one says it out loud. No one explains it to you, but you feel it. The glances that pass over you, your words getting cut off, your opinions no one responds. And you ask yourself, what did I do wrong? The truth is, you didn't do anything wrong. You are just sending signals you are not aware of. In this world, looking poor is not about money. It is how you walk into a room, how you look at others, how you react when doubted, and how you try to prove yourself. The more you try to prove, the more you are seen as untrustworthy. The more you try to look okay, the more you reveal instability. And the most dangerous part is, most of these signals you are sending unconsciously. You think you are controlling how others see you. No, you are just revealing yourself without realizing it. Today, I will show you why people judge you within seconds, why looking weak is more dangerous than actually being weak, and the small behaviors that are destroying your value every day. Stay until the end, because maybe the reason you are not respected is not in this world. It lies in the way you are showing up in it. I want you to remember one thing before going further. No one truly listens to you at the beginning. They observe you. Before a single word is spoken, before you have a chance to explain who you are, their brain has already started working. It does not wait for logic. It does not need data. It only needs a few small signals to form an initial conclusion. And that conclusion usually happens within seconds. You walk into a room. You think people are busy, no one is paying attention. But in reality, they have already looked at you. Not directly, but through a quick glance, an unconscious scan. Your posture, your pace, your eye contact, everything is recorded. And from those tiny fragments, they begin constructing an image. Not the real image of you, but the image they believe is correct. This is how humans operate, not because they are bad, but because they need speed. The brain is designed to recognize patterns. It does not analyze every detail. It looks for familiarity. It asks a very simple question. What type of person is this? And once it finds an answer, it stops. You are not evaluated as an independent individual. You are placed into a pre-existing mold. Once you are put into that mold, everything you do afterward only serves to confirm it. If you are read as lacking confidence, every action you take will be seen through that lens. You speak slowly, they think you hesitate. You speak quickly, they think you are trying to prove something. You stay silent, they think you have nothing to say. There is no correct choice. The problem is not in the behavior. The problem is in how you were defined from the beginning. This explains a phenomenon you may have experienced. There are people who say less than you, yet are listened to more. There are people who explain nothing, yet their words carry weight, and you don't understand why. You think they are better. Not necessarily. They were simply not placed in a position where they had to prove themselves. They walk in with an already accepted image, and from there, everything becomes easy. While you walk in with an image that needs to be verified, and from there, everything becomes difficult. This is the point most people do not want to accept. They believe that if they are good enough, right enough, and try hard enough, others will recognize their value. No, people only recognize what fits their initial impression. Your true value is not rejected. It is simply not seen. And the more you try to draw attention to it, the worse you make the problem. Because when you try to prove, you send a very clear signal that you are not yet acknowledged, that you need acknowledgement. And in the eyes of others, that need is a sign, not of value, but of lack of value. I have seen this happen too many times. Someone walks into a meeting, speaks a lot, explains clearly, presents logical arguments, but no one is truly convinced. Not because they are wrong, but because they are trying too hard. Another person says less, even incomplete things, yet people lean toward them, not because the content is better, but because the way they show up does not create a sense of need. They do not need to be believed, and that is exactly what makes them easier to believe. You need to understand this at a deeper level. Trust does not begin with words. It begins with a feeling. A very vague feeling, hard to name, yet extremely powerful. Either you make others feel stability, or you make them feel that something is off. And once the second feeling appears, you are already at a disadvantage. You can be right, you can act correctly, but everything you do will be questioned. Not because you are wrong, but because you failed the first moment. This is why most people fail without understanding why. They fix their behavior, they improve their skills, they learn to speak better, but they never touch what truly determines everything: how they are seen before they are heard. And when you understand that, a different question begins to emerge. Not what you are saying, but what kind of person you look like in the eyes of others. You just asked yourself a question. What kind of person do you look like in the eyes of others? This is where things become a bit more uncomfortable, because most people, when they hear the phrase "looking poor," think about money. They think about clothes, material things, living conditions. But that is not what is happening. Looking poor is not directly related to how much money you have. It is related to the signals you emit. You may have money, you may have knowledge, you may have capability, but if what you express makes others feel that you are in need, lacking, seeking validation, then in their eyes, you are still in a lower position. Humans do not respond to truth. They respond to feeling. And the strongest feeling that shapes how they treat you is not whether you are right or wrong. It is whether you need them or not. A person who needs nothing from you always holds a different position. They are not rushed. They do not try. They do not seek to prove. And that creates a kind of force that is hard to explain. You feel they are stable. You feel they are independent. You feel they are not affected by how you see them. And because of that, you begin to respect them. On the other hand, when someone walks in with an invisible need, everything changes. They smile more than necessary. They explain more than necessary. They respond faster than necessary. Each action alone may not be noticeable, but combined, it creates a very clear signal that they are trying. And when someone is trying, you immediately sense one thing: that they are not yet in the position they want you to believe. This is the paradox most people do not realize. You think if you show more, others will see your value. But in reality, the more you show, the more you are read as lacking. Not because you are weak, but because your behavior carries traces of lack. Observe a simple situation. Two people enter a conversation. The first person tries to keep the conversation flowing. They constantly add information, ask questions, fill the gaps. They do not want silence. The second person says less. They are not quick to respond. They allow silence to exist without feeling the need to fill it. You will see what happens. The first person gradually fades, not because they have nothing to say, but because they say too much to maintain attention. The second person, with just one sentence, makes everyone pause. Not because the sentence is better, but because they do not need to say much to be heard. That is the difference between someone seeking value and someone who already has position. And this is what you need to face. Maybe you do not lack capability, but you are emitting signals of someone who lacks status. You are trying to maintain connection. You are trying to maintain an image. You are trying to avoid being judged. And all those efforts, paradoxically, are exactly what cause you to be judged. Humans do not need analysis to see this. They feel it. A slightly hesitant glance, a slightly too quick response, an unnecessary explanation. All of it creates an impression, not clear, not spoken, but enough for them to adjust how they treat you. And once that impression is formed, you will find yourself in a familiar position. You have to say more to be heard. You have to do more to be trusted. You have to try more to be acknowledged. And that loop does not stop on its own. Because every time you try, you reinforce the original image. You are not getting out. You are going deeper. What makes it dangerous is that you do not realize you are doing it. You think you are showing professionalism. You think you are showing enthusiasm. You think you are doing the right thing. But underneath it all, another layer of signals is running. A layer you do not control. A layer others can read before you even notice. And that is why two people with the same capability are treated completely differently. One is trusted immediately. The other has to prove themselves constantly. Not because the difference lies in what they know, but in what they project. When you start to see this, another realization begins to appear. The problem is not that you need to do more. It is that you need to stop certain things. Stop trying to fill every silence. Stop reacting instantly to every signal. Stop explaining things no one asks for. Because sometimes what makes you look poor is not what you lack, but what you cannot stop showing. And from here, a deeper layer begins to emerge. It is not just what you do, but the very small, almost invisible signals that are shaping how others read you every day. You begin to realize something. The problem is not in what you say. It is in what you don't notice. Very small signals, almost invisible, but constantly present in the way you show up. You do not intentionally create them. You do not even realize when they happen, but others can feel them. Not through thinking, through feeling. The human brain does not analyze you like a problem. It reads you like a pattern. It looks for consistency between what you show and what it expects. Just one small deviation, one slight mismatch is enough to create doubt. You can say you are confident, but if your eyes avoid contact for a moment, the real message has already changed. You can say you are certain, but if your voice slows down for a beat before answering, the listener's brain will register it. You can say you do not need validation, but if you respond instantly every time someone texts you, the signal says something else. This is how micro-signals work. They do not need to be big. They do not need to be obvious. They only need to repeat. And when they repeat long enough, they form a pattern. That pattern becomes how others define you. No one sits down to analyze your every action, but they remember how they feel around you. They remember whether you make them feel stable or make them adjust. Someone who makes you adjust is always in the lower position, because they are unconsciously asking you to manage their state. They need you to respond quickly. They need you to understand them. They need you to confirm them. And every time they need, their position drops a little. What is interesting is that most of these behaviors come from good intentions. You want to be polite. You want to be clear. You want to avoid bothering others. But the result goes in the opposite direction. The more you try to control how others see you, the more you reveal that you care too much about it. And when you care too much, you lose stability. People trust stability, not perfection, not excellence, stability. A person can make mistakes and still be trusted if they do not fluctuate. A person can speak imperfectly and still be heard if they do not constantly shift their state. On the other hand, someone can be completely correct, highly logical, but if their state changes based on others' reactions, they will be read as untrustworthy because they cannot hold themselves. Look at a familiar situation. You send a message. There is no reply. 10 minutes pass and you start thinking, maybe they have not seen it. Maybe they are busy. Then you send another message, just to check. That action seems small, but the signal it sends is not small. It says you are uncomfortable with uncertainty. It says you need a response to feel stable. And the receiver, even without consciously thinking, can feel that. Next time they see your message, they do not just see the content. They see the state attached to it, a state that needs a response. And that creates pressure. Over time, that pressure turns into distance. Not because they dislike you, but because they do not want to manage your state. On the other hand, some people send one message and stop. Not because they do not care, but because they do not need to control the outcome. They allow space to exist. They accept not knowing. And that ability creates a very different signal, a signal of stability. You do not feel pulled toward them. You do not feel the need to respond immediately. And because of that, you are more likely to come back to them. This is something many people never realize. They think effective communication means saying more, responding faster, clarifying more. But in reality, powerful communication is often about reducing reaction, reducing explanation, reducing the need to fill. Not to become cold, but to avoid distorting your own signal. Because every extra action carries a layer of information, and that layer is often not in your favor. You do not need to say you are confident. You just need to stop doing things that make you look not confident. That is the difference. Not adding, removing. When you begin to remove unnecessary signals, something interesting happens. You do not need to try to create an impression. The impression forms on its own, not because you do more, but because you no longer interfere with how others read you. And when you look back, you will see most of the things that made you seem low value were not big mistakes, just small deviations, moments you reacted too quickly, times you added an unnecessary sentence, moments you tried to make things look better. Each one insignificant, but accumulated, they form a very clear image, an image you do not control.
And once that image is established, everything that follows is just a reaction to it.
You are no longer seen as you think. You are seen as what you have unconsciously repeated. And at this point, something becomes unavoidable.
If small signals can break your position, then they are also where real power begins to form.
You have just touched a point most people never see. Small signals can break your position. And what makes it more complicated is that most of those signals do not come from obvious weakness.
They come from over-trying.
You think that if you perform better, others will value you more. You speak more clearly. You prepare more carefully. You respond faster. You try to make sure nothing is misunderstood. But that effort creates the opposite effect. When you try to control how others see you, you enter a state of performance. You are no longer naturally present. You are managing an image. And people are highly sensitive to that. They do not analyze it. They feel it. They feel something slightly off. Not because you are being fake, but because you are trying too hard to be right. Think about an interview. Someone answers perfectly. Smooth wording, complete content. Everything is correct. But something still feels off. No one says it, but everyone feels it. Not because they are wrong, but because everything is too smooth, too controlled, too arranged. It makes the listener ask a subtle question. Is this person being themselves or trying to be an acceptable version? And once that question appears, trust starts to drop. On the other hand, someone else is not perfect. They pause before answering. They admit when they are unsure. They do not try to make everything look complete. But they feel real, not because they are better, but because they are not trying to control how they are seen. That is the difference. One side is trying to prove, the other simply exists. And in social dynamics, the second always has the advantage, because they do not emit need. While when you overperform, you send a very clear signal that you need this outcome, that you need recognition, that you are uncomfortable if things do not go your way. And that puts you in a weak position, not because you are weak, but because you do not allow yourself to remain stable without validation. This is where many people misunderstand. They think doing more creates trust. But in reality, trust does not come from doing more. It comes from not needing to do more. When you over-explain, you show you do not fully trust what you say. When you apologize before being rejected, you show you have already accepted rejection. When you add too many details to clarify, you show you fear being misunderstood. Each action has a logical reason, but the signal it creates goes in another direction. It says you are not grounded, and people do not trust what is not grounded. They do not need you to be completely right. They need you to be stable. A stable person can be wrong and still be trusted. An unstable person, even when right, will still be questioned. You may have experienced this. You know you are right. You have solid reasoning, but you still feel the need to say more, explain more, convince more. And the more you speak, the more weight you lose. Not because your content is weak, but because you are revealing that you need others to believe you. And when you need, you lose position. A person with position does not need to persuade. They speak and stop. Not because they do not care, but because they do not need to control the outcome. They let others reach their own conclusions, and that space gives their words weight. You cannot create that by adding more. You can only achieve it by removing urgency, removing the need to be understood immediately, removing the habit of filling every silence with words. When you do that, a shift begins. You stop chasing others' reactions. You hold your state. And when you hold your state, others begin to adjust to you. Not because you demand it, but because you do not change. That is how position is formed. Not from big actions, but from not being pulled by small reactions. And when you look back, you will see something else. Most of what you once thought was trying to improve was actually subtle ways of seeking validation, not from others, but from your own internal feeling. You need to feel okay. You need to feel accepted. And to achieve that, you start doing more than necessary. But the more you do, the further you move away from the state you are seeking, because that state does not come from action. It comes from not being dependent on the result of that action. And when you begin to see this, a deeper layer appears. It is not what you need to do to be trusted. It is what you need to remove that is making you doubted. you begin to see something more clearly. It is not that you lack capability, you lack consistency. You can say the right things, you can do the right things. But if your internal state does not match what you show externally, others will feel that mismatch. Not through thought, through feeling. And that feeling always comes before logic. This is where most people do not realize. They believe that as long as they say the right things, do the right things, prepare enough, others will trust them. But trust does not start with logic. It starts with alignment between what you say, how you say it, and the state you carry. When those three do not match, the other person's brain does not need to analyze. It only needs a brief moment to sense something is off. You say you are confident, but your voice drops at the end of the sentence. You say you are certain, but you add an unnecessary explanation. You say you do not need agreement, but you watch others' reactions after every sentence. Each detail is small, but together they form a clear signal that you are performing a state, not actually in it. And when someone feels that, trust begins to decrease. Not because they think you are lying, but because they do not know which part of you to trust. Humans are uncomfortable with ambiguity. They need a consistent image to rely on. When you cannot provide that, they create another image. And that image is usually not in your favor. This is why two people with the same information create completely different reactions. One says less, but their words carry weight. The other says more, but no one truly believes them. The difference is not in the content. It is in the alignment between inside and outside. When you are truly certain, you do not need to show certainty. It appears naturally in how you speak, in your rhythm, in your pauses without the need to fill them. When you truly do not need validation, you do not track others' reactions after every sentence. You do not adjust yourself based on their expressions. You do not change your pace just because they seem distracted. You remain the same. And that creates a very strong signal, not of perfection, but of stability. On the other hand, when you are not certain, you start adjusting. You speak faster when you feel others are not paying attention. You explain more when they do not react. You smile more to reduce tension. You add energy to maintain connection. All of it is natural, but all of it reveals your real state. You do not need to say you are not okay. The way you move in the conversation already says it. This is why trying to fake confidence rarely works. You can control your words, but you cannot control the entire signal system at once. A delayed glance, a shifted breath, a slight hesitation, all are enough to break the image you are trying to build. And the other person, even if they cannot name it, still feels the mismatch. Meanwhile, when you are in your real state, everything becomes simpler. You do not need to remember what to say. You do not need to adjust every detail. You do not need to maintain an image in your head. You just respond. And when that response comes from a stable state, it becomes naturally consistent. That is what creates real trust. Not technique, not strategy, alignment. Between thought over comfortable in your state. The both is amazing program from what you might be real. But they're doing some things like this. The structure of this could not be feel that they feels also feel the program. You take it real state with ever. Now priest to become simpler, but also when you are little bit more is a change to the program. The trendler of their name will not provide it something built-in and usually build. That is what creates real trust, not very simpler. That is what creates real trust, not being built. You do not need to start a midsmith face and knowledge as well. Between thought, emotion, and behavior. And the hardest part is that most people do not realize they are misaligned. They believe they are being themselves. They believe they are being honest. But in reality, they are constantly adjusting. Based on others' reactions, based on context, based on the fear of being judged. That adjustment is not wrong. But when it becomes the default, you lose something important, your own stability. And when you are not stable, others cannot place trust in you. Not because you are untrustworthy, but because you do not maintain a consistent version for them to rely on. When you begin to see this, you realize something else. Trust is not something you build from the outside. It is the result of no longer managing how you appear. When there is nothing to hide, when there is nothing to adjust, when what you say and what you are not separate, others do not need to guess. They only need to observe. And in that observation, trust forms. No persuasion needed, no explanation needed, only consistency repeated over time. And when you hold that consistency, something else begins to appear, not from words, but from your presence. A very quiet kind of power, one that does not need to be shown, yet is still recognized. You have just touched something very few people truly understand. Power does not lie in what you express. It lies in what you can hold back. When you no longer have to manage your image, something begins to change. You no longer react immediately. You no longer feel the need to fill every gap. You are no longer pulled by other people's rhythm. You begin to hold back. Hold back your words. Hold back your reactions. Hold back the need to be understood immediately. And that restraint creates a completely different kind of signal, a signal that others cannot ignore. Because people are used to being pushed by words, they are used to others trying to convince them. They are used to every silence being filled. When you do not do that, you break the familiar pattern. And when the pattern is broken, attention appears. Not because you say more, but because you say less. Not because you do more, but because you do not do what others expect. This is where restraint becomes power. Not forced silence, not pretending to be cold, but the ability to tolerate space without needing to control it. You may have experienced this. A conversation slows down. There is a pause. Most people feel uncomfortable. They say something to fill it, regardless of whether it is necessary, just to avoid silence. But a person with position does not. They let the space exist. They are not rushed. They do not feel the need to fix it. And that alone changes the entire dynamic of the conversation. Others begin to adjust to them, not because they ask, but because they are not driven by discomfort. Comfort with silence is a rare signal. It says you do not need to control the outcome. It says you are not dependent on others' reactions. It says you are stable. And when you are stable, others begin to see you as a reference point. Not because you are right, but because you do not fluctuate. On the other hand, when you react immediately to every signal, you let others control your state. A question makes you talk more. A glance makes you explain more. A pause makes you rush to fill it. You think you are being proactive, but in reality, you are being led. You are adjusting to every small change in the environment. And that reveals something very clearly, that you cannot hold yourself. People do not trust what is easily influenced. They trust what maintains its form, regardless of what changes around it. This is why high-status individuals often speak less. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they do not need words to hold their position. They do not need to prove. They do not need to explain. They do not need to react to everything. They choose when to speak. They choose when to stay silent. And that choice creates weight. When you know you can speak but choose not to, every word you say carries more value. When you can react but do not react immediately, your state becomes less predictable. And that unpredictability creates attention. Not loud attention, but the kind that makes others watch. They begin to wonder what you are thinking. They begin to listen more carefully when you speak. They begin to give you more space. Not because you ask, but because you do not fill it. This is a paradox many people do not accept. They believe that to gain attention, they need to do more. But in reality, to gain weight, you need to do less. Less reacting, less explaining, less displaying. Not to become distant, but to avoid diluting your signal. Because every time you speak unnecessarily, you reduce the value of your next words. Every time you react instantly, you lose the ability to create distance. Every time you try to maintain connection at all costs, you trade away your position. When you begin to remove unnecessary reactions, something happens. You do not need to try to be different. Difference appears on its own. You do not need to try to create influence. Influence forms naturally. Not because you are stronger, but because you are no longer spending energy on things that weaken you. And when you look back, you will see most of what you once thought was necessary was just reflex. A reflex to silence, a reflex to uncertainty, a reflex to the fear of being ignored. You were not truly choosing those actions. You were reacting. And when you stop reacting, you begin to have choice. You choose when to step in. You choose when to step back. You choose when to speak. You choose when not to. That choice is not something everyone has, and that is why it becomes a form of power. Not loud power, but the kind that makes others adjust to you. And when you hold that state long enough, something else begins to form. Not from single actions, but from how you repeat that state over time. An image, an impression, a way others begin to default to when they think of you. You do not need to tell anyone who you are. They have already decided that long ago. Not from one moment, but from repetition. Each small signal, each familiar reaction, each way you show up in different situations. Every time they register it, not with clear memory, but with accumulated feeling. And over time, that feeling becomes something concrete, a stable image of you. This is what most people do not realize. You are not judged based on what you do today. You are judged based on the pattern you have repeated long enough. When that pattern forms, it becomes a system. An invisible system, but very rigid. Every new action you take is filtered through that system before it is understood. If you have been seen as uncertain, every time you speak, others will look for signs that confirm it. Not because they intend to, but because their brain already has a model. It does not look for truth, it looks for consistency. If you have been seen as needing validation, every action you take will be read that way. You respond quickly, they see need. You explain more, they see need. You try to maintain connection, they see need. And each time they see that, the old image is reinforced. You are not escaping it. You are repeating what put you there. This is why many people feel stuck. They have changed. They have realized the problem. They have tried to act differently. But others' reactions remain the same, and they do not understand why. The reason is simple. You are trying to change behavior while the perception system about you is still intact. You speak less, but they still expect you to speak more. You respond slower, but they still think you are hesitating. You stay silent, but they think you have nothing to say. Not because they are wrong, but because they are seeing you through an older version, a version you built yourself before. Once that system is formed, change is no longer a single action. It is an overwrite process. You do not just need to act differently. You need to act differently long enough to break the old pattern. This is where most people quit. They try to change. They do not see different reactions. They go back to old behavior, and in that moment, they reinforce the original image, not to others, but to the system that is reading them. You need to understand something. Reputation is not what you declare. It is what others silently agree on. No meeting happens. No one sits down to decide who you are, but through hundreds of small interactions, a consensus forms. This person is trustworthy. That person needs control. This person is stable. That person is not. And once that consensus appears, it becomes default. You enter a new conversation, but you do not start from zero. You carry your entire history. Not the history you remember, but the history others have felt. This is what makes it feel unfair. You think each opportunity is a fresh start, but in reality, each opportunity is a continuation. You are not evaluated independently. You are read as part of a sequence, and that sequence only changes when you change long enough. Not once, not a few times, but consistently, until the old system no longer has enough data to exist. This is where restraint and congruence begin to merge. You do not just hold back. You hold back consistently. You are not aligned in one situation. You are aligned in all situations. No different versions depending on who you face. No shifting under pressure. No reacting when tested. You remain the same. And when you remain the same long enough, something happens. Others begin to update you, not because you tell them, but because they no longer see the old pattern. They look for familiar signals, but they cannot find them. And when they cannot find them, they are forced to create a new model. That is how you break out, not by proving you have changed, but by no longer behaving the same way. Repeat that long enough. No explanation, no announcement, just different. And when the new model starts to form, everything changes. You speak less, but are heard more. You do not explain, but are doubted less. You do not try to create influence, but influence still appears. Not because you become better in others' eyes, but because you stop producing signals that create doubt. And at this point, something becomes clear. Maybe the problem was never your capability, but how you unconsciously built your image over time. You have just reached a point very few people are willing to face. Maybe the problem was never your capability, but how you have shown up long enough for others to believe that is who you are. And this is the part many people find hardest to accept, not because it is complex, but because it is simple. You are not undervalued because others misunderstand you. You are undervalued because what you show is too clear. You are not being misread. You are being read correctly based on what you repeatedly display. You think you are doing the right thing. You think you are being polite. You think you are trying. But if those behaviors consistently place you in a position where you have to prove, explain, and maintain connection at all costs, then others have no reason to see you differently. They are not against you. They are simply responding to what you show them. This is the truth most people avoid. They want to believe that if they are good enough, others will recognize it. They want to believe that if they are patient, things will change. But the world does not work that way. People do not search for truth. They search for consistency. If you have shown them a version of yourself repeatedly, they will believe that version. Not because it is accurate, but because it is stable. And the brain always chooses what is stable. You may have experienced this. You enter a new environment. You want a fresh start. You want to show up better. But after a few interactions, everything returns to the same pattern. You get interrupted again. You have to speak more to be heard. You have to explain more to be trusted. Not because you did not change, but because you carried the same signals. Just a few familiar cues are enough to reactivate the old system, and you fall back into the same position. This is what you need to face. You are not lacking ability. You are being consistent in a way that does not serve you. You are not weak, but you are emitting signals of someone in a weaker position. You do not lack value, but you are behaving as if you need others to validate that value. And when you need, you lose. This is not a flaw. It is a pattern built over time, from moments you avoided conflict, from times you chose to explain instead of staying silent, from moments you reacted to maintain connection. Each small decision, unnoticeable, but accumulated, it creates the way you move in the world. And that way, whether you are aware or not, is being read by others. What makes it harder is that you do not see your own pattern clearly. You only see the results. You see yourself being undervalued. You see yourself not being heard. You see yourself having to try more than others. But you do not see the signals that led there. You do not see the moments you reacted too quickly. You do not see the times you added unnecessary words. You do not see when you adjusted to others without noticing. And because you do not see, you do not change. You just try harder. You speak better. You prepare more. But you keep the same pattern, and the result stays the same. This is the loop many people are stuck in. They think the problem is skill, when in reality, the problem is how they show up. You do not need another strategy. You need to see what you are doing automatically. The small reflexes, the things you assume are normal, the things you have never questioned. Because those are what define you, not in your eyes, but in others. And when you start to see that, something else appears. Not comfort, but clarity. Clarity that you do not need to do more. You need to stop at the right moments. Stop before you add another sentence. Stop before you react. Stop before you try to fix how others feel. Because every time you do not stop, you reinforce the old image. And every time you do stop, you create a different possibility. A possibility that did not exist before. And when you are patient enough to hold that, a path begins to open. Not a path based on doing more, but on removing what has been keeping you in a lower position. You do not need a new strategy. You need to pause long enough to see what you are doing. Most of what is keeping you in a lower position is not a lack of knowledge, not a lack of skill, but the reflexes you repeat every day without realizing. And if you want to change how others see you, you do not start by doing more. You start by removing. Not removing who you are, but removing the behaviors that cause you to be misread. The starting point is not external. It is in a very small moment right before you react. When there is silence and you feel the need to speak. When there is a question and you want to answer immediately. When there is a glance and you want to adjust how you present yourself. That is where everything happens. Not in big actions, but in small decisions right before action. The first strategy is not about doing something. It is about not doing, not speaking the moment you can, not explaining when no one has asked, not reacting just because you feel the urge to react. At first, this will feel uncomfortable. You will feel like you are lacking. You will feel like you are missing opportunities. You will feel like others might misunderstand you. But that feeling is exactly what you need to go through. Because before, you always acted to avoid that feeling. And that is what kept you in the old pattern. When you stop running from that discomfort, you begin to hold your state. And when you hold your state, you begin to change how others read you. Not immediately, but enough to create a difference. The second strategy is to keep your own pace. Do not let the environment determine your speed. If others speak fast, you do not need to speak fast. If others react strongly, you do not need to react the same way. If others create pressure, you do not need to relieve it immediately. You hold your rhythm. You hold your pace, you hold your state, and when you are not pulled along, you become a stable point in an unstable environment. That is what people are naturally drawn to, not because you stand out, but because you do not fluctuate. The third strategy is to speak less, but with precision. Not complete silence, but selection. Every time you speak, you know why you are speaking. Not to fill space, not to maintain connection. Not to avoid silence, but because it is necessary. When you do that, your words begin to carry weight, not because they are more complex, but because they are not diluted. The fourth strategy is to stop managing how others see you. You cannot control perception by constantly adjusting. You only make your signal unstable. Instead, you maintain a consistent state. You do not change for each person. You do not adjust for each reaction. You do not try to fix what others might think. You let them observe. And over time, that consistency creates a clearer image than any explanation ever could. The final strategy is to accept being misunderstood in the short term. This is the hardest part, because you are used to correcting immediately when there is misunderstanding. You want to make sure others see you correctly. But every time you rush to fix it, you fall back into the old pattern. You explain, you prove, you seek validation, and you lose position. When you allow some misunderstandings to exist, you create space. That space does not weaken you. It makes you harder to read. And when you are harder to read, you are not quickly boxed in. You have room for a new image to form. This is not about becoming cold. Not about disconnecting from others. It is about no longer being controlled by the need to be understood immediately. When you can do that, you will notice a shift. You no longer feel the need to chase reactions. You no longer feel the need to keep everything under control. You begin to operate from a different state, a state not dependent on immediate outcomes. And that state is what others feel, not through your words, but through your presence. You do not need to say you have value. You do not need to prove you are trustworthy. You only need to stop doing the things that make you appear otherwise, not adding, removing. And when you remove enough, something begins to appear. Not something you create, but something that was always there, just hidden. A stable state, a way of showing up that needs no explanation, a feeling that makes others stop questioning. And when they stop questioning, trust appears. Not because you convince them, but because you no longer give them a reason to doubt. And from there, one final thing becomes clear. You do not need to become someone else. You only need to stop being the version that caused you to be undervalued. At this point, you begin to see something clearly. It is not that you lack value. You have simply become used to expressing yourself in ways that prevent that value from being seen. You are used to saying a little more, explaining a little more, reacting a little faster, just to make sure you are not misunderstood. But those little things have shaped how others see you, not once, but hundreds of times. And then you wonder why you are not respected, why you are not heard, why you always have to try harder than others. The answer is not in the world. It is in how you have been showing up in it. Not in big moments, but in small reflexes you never questioned. But this also means you can change it, not by becoming perfect, not by learning another skill, but by stopping. Stopping before you add another sentence. Stopping before you react. Stopping before you try to fix how others see you. When you can do that long enough, something happens. You no longer have to try to be respected. You no longer have to prove to be trusted. You no longer have to chase to maintain connection. Everything begins to shift, not because others change, but because you stop sending signals that make them doubt. And when doubt is gone, they begin to see you differently. Fewer questions, less testing, more acknowledgement. Not because you speak better, but because you no longer need to say too much. If you begin to see yourself in what was just described, pause for a moment. Not to feel bad, but to observe. Observe how you react. Observe what you do automatically, because that is where everything starts to change. And there's one more thing you can do, not for yourself, for someone else. Someone you know who is stuck in the same pattern. They are trying, they are explaining, they are seeking recognition, but they do not understand why nothing changes. Do not explain it to them. Just send them this video. Sometimes the right perspective at the right moment can change how someone sees themselves. And if you want to keep seeing truths like this, the kind that are not easy to hear but impossible to ignore, subscribe to Rise of Mind. Not to feel better, but to understand more clearly. And once you see clearly, you will not be able to go back to how you were before.